Croeso I Hustings, etholiad cyffredinol to the sector. Welcome to the general election Hustings for the third sector. Diolch I Hwb Cymhagau am y croeso. Thank you very much to the Cymhagau Hub for the welcome. We're also live streaming this evening's activity on all our social media channels. And we will be taking questions and checking for any questions online. Mae'r cyfan yn mynd allan ar cyfryngau cymdeithasol heno, a fyddwn ni yn holi I weld os na unrhyw gwestiynau ar-lein. Mi fydd hefyd yn cael ei recordio. Barring any technical glitches, it will also be recorded, so we'll be sending a link to this evening's session out tomorrow if you want to share it with anybody who can't be here and can't join us this evening. Felly, rhannwch os bod unrhyw un sydd ddim yn gallu bod gyda ni heno, fi'n sefyd yn rhan o'n iddo. Fenw I yw Hazel, a fydda i'n cadeirio heno. My name is Hazel and I'll be chairing this evening, and I'm Chief Executive of the Ceredigion Association of Voluntary Organisations, and we support the third sector volunteers and community action across Ceredigion. Mae CAVO yn cefnogi'r trydydd sector, gwirfoddolwyr a gweithred cymunedol dros Ceredigion. A mae'n bleser bod llon lled ni ar y panel heno, ymddiheuriadau o Amanda, ond mae Sam yma I gymryd I lle ni. We've got a full panel here this evening, and it's a pleasure to chair this evening's Hustings, especially in a county like Ceredigion. BBC have claimed that we are on our own electoral planet. Debyg ar blaned etholiadol yn hun yn Ceredigion, felly mae fe hun ddiddorol yn diwedd yn y sir. Mi fyddwn ni'n cychwyn trwy holi I bob ymgeisydd I 5 munud I weid ychydig am ei hunain. We will start by asking each candidate to say 5 minutes about themselves, and Sam will say 5 minutes on behalf of Amanda. Gyda bod yn bwysig bod ni'n dod I nabod ein ymgeiswyr ni fel unigolion. It's very, very important that we get the opportunity to get to know our candidates as individuals, as people. So it's a really, really good place to start. We do have a couple of questions that have been submitted. As I say, we'll check social media and then we'll open it up to the audience. But I will try. It's always quite difficult with Westminster elections because of devolved issues. Mae'n hyd yn ychydig o challenge sydd ni gyda bod gymaint o bethau materion wedi cael ei datganoli. But we will try and focus our intention on Westminster issues this evening and what the candidates could do to address issues that are important to citizens in Ceredigion. Nawn ni ganolbwyntio beth allan ymgeiswyr yn wneud I edrych ar materion sy'n bwysig I trigolion Ceredigion. Felly, os ewn ni I gychwyn, we shall start with the 5-minute introduction. I'll be turning. So if we start with Mark.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Hazel. Thank you very much for the invitation to this Hustings. I just want to reflect a moment or two on the importance of the voluntary sector. It's really appropriate that we're actually here in the Hook, because this building actually is one of those iconic community projects which is an example of a community being empowered to do something good for their community. We're on the site, I look around this audience, I think most people I'm familiar with in the audience. If you don't know, I'll introduce myself. I'm Mark Williams, I was the MP for 12 years. I lost the election last time, I'm standing again in this election. But this building was based on the old boxing club that was here. That in itself was a community project. But from that grew something really iconic. And the Hook, not just this building, which we're lucky to be out in the cold this evening, but it really is a centre of this community, born out of the Community First project that sadly was stopped for this part of the world. A group of individuals decided that they would create this And that reflects to me on just something I feel very strongly about, and I think my party does, and no doubt others on this platform do as well. The power of local people to come together to solve their own problems and make a better life for their neighbourhood. So that is all laudable stuff, and it's appropriate, and that's what's happened here. And I think as politicians, we must be looking for ways to support, through social investment, supporting and ensuring that charities and social enterprises can access the kind of support they need in order to make those community projects a reality. And I just reflect on some of those ones over the years that I've been involved with. I think about projects like the Usmith Transport Project, Jigsaw in Cardigan, the Aberystwyth 50 Plus group, the Aberystwyth Friendship group, this hub, this place, the excellent Cletur. We think of these projects as maybe essentially urban, but they're a rural project, again designed to combat social isolation, bringing people together to healthy competition next door. And projects in rural areas as well, like Cletur, garage being shut, losing a shop, and some inspirational people in Cheddar coming together to create an asset that's far greater than anything that was ever there before. All of those, I think, are buttressed by this principle about dealing with the problems of rural isolation and loneliness. Somebody said to me the other day that one of the big things that the Beveridge Report of 1944 didn't deal with was the issue of loneliness. And I think people talk about community and community values degenerating and collapsing, and maybe in some parts of this country they are, but I still believe that in this county they are strong. And with the right kind of support, the work of CAVO illustrates that. The number of projects that you support, we can advance things in a very powerful way. I think of one or two of the things I've been involved with in the last 2 or 3 years. The Hospice at Home Aberystwyth Volunteers. I'm a trustee of that organisation. Again, volunteers coming together, recognising that there was a gap in the provision for carers, particularly in this community, raising large sums of money in a shop in Pier Street in Aberystwyth, and now taking over Clasan Tower across the road. So that the lamentable position of us being the only county where we haven't got a facility for carers, a respite facility for carers, a day facility for carers, can be alleviated. I think of the work, I'm the president of a local branch of the Royal British Legion, and the work we do, not just in the important act of remembrance on Remembrance Sunday, but the pastoral work that's done, advising and helping veterans, often by volunteer welfare officers, to access the benefits and housing and other issues that they're entitled to. I think of the work that several of us on this platform have done in terms of adult social care, and Dinah was there, and Ben was there. The work that we have done in trying to protect Budlondeb, we lost that battle. However, the work that we have done now in our Elder Persons Forum, trying to highlight the inadequacies of older persons' care in this county. A project I'm initiating in my own village, an individual, but I've got other people involved in this now, about making my community a dementia-friendly community, calling a meeting, getting the consent of the local community council, pulling people together so that we as a community can advance that particular agenda and move that one forward. It's a bit of a ramble what I've just said, Hazel, but I hope it illustrates that over the years, I've been committed to this community. I remain committed to the community above all else. It's been very good to me since my student days in this community. And all of us, I think, regardless of our party, are determined to put something back into this community at whatever level we function. That's the right way to put it. Just an indication of where I stand.
Yeah, a bit too easy now. Yes. But I'm Gethin James, not as I did. I'm Gethin James, I'm from Aberporth, born and bred, 4th generation, living in the same property. I'm very proud actually that I'm still running a business there in the same property. My great-grandfather set up a business in 1910. Many of you will know me. I was a county councillor and represented Aberporth on Ceredigion County Council from 2004 to 2017. During the time I was there, I was a cabinet member. I had a portfolio of environmental services, housing and planning services. I lost my seat in 2017 and but I've spent 15 years in working in public service in Ceredigion and working with voluntary organisations as a county councillor. I did stand in 2015 in the general election. At that time, I had, through my work as a councillor, actually, become quite a sceptic, and I joined UKIP, which wasn't too popular with some. And I did campaign and fight to fight for Brexit, although we didn't even know the word Brexit before the referendum was fought and won. But we did have a referendum in 2016, and I thought I was done with politics, to be honest, after I finished on the county council. Until the last 2.5 years, really, has been getting more and more aggravating in the fact that we took a democratic vote to this country. We were given the choice. The government of the day, David Cameron said it would be the people's choice whether we left the European Union or not. There was a clear decision to leave, and at every turn we've had politicians from all of the parties on this table trying to undermine that and ensure that that democratic choice of people was not carried forward. So back in March, when we could see that, again, the leave date was coming close and we weren't going to leave, I was inspired really to put my name forward for this new party, the Brexit Party. We were there to fight for democracy, really. To our mind, the referendum was won, and the whole thing really was about democracy now. So I did stand in the European elections, where there was great support shown for the Brexit Party, and I think that demonstrated people's anger, really, that things hadn't moved forward. And therefore, I'm standing in this general election, really trying to ensure that the democratic will that was exercised by the people of Britain is carried out. So that's all.
Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Helo, Dan Mohammed dwi'n plaid llafur Ceredigion, dwi'n dysgu Cymraeg, ond allai ddim cofio'n pan dwi'n under pressure. So I have a Welsh learner, but I'm really rubbish under pressure. So I'm sorry about that, and I'll continue in English if you don't mind. Thank you very much, Jack and Marianne, for inviting me here tonight. I'm a single parent. I'm 57 years old. I've been Lancashire. I'm a town councillor in Lancashire. And I stood for election for the Labour Party in 2017. And we actually did extremely well. We moved from 5th place into 3rd place, and we had a massive swing in our favour. This election looks like it will be a very, very exciting election. We heard on Sunday, in fact, that tactical voting sites are now placing it as a Plaid Cymru and Labour marginal. So that is making the whole thing very, very, very exciting. I think it's fantastic that we've got this here in Ceredigion. I'd like to echo what Mark said. This building is a testament to the kind of values that keep the third sector going. And it's built with the hard work of volunteers and their amazing funding applications, which is an extraordinary skill, as I found out myself in the work that I'm involved in Victoria Hall. Under the last Labour government, this Pen Party got Communities First funding, which Mark referred to as well, and that actually transformed the community. But that doesn't mean that there aren't issues here still, because there are. And other communities in Ceredigion, there are issues as well. And we have poverty rates, child poverty rates in Ceredigion that are extraordinarily high. In Bredor Ward and in Tavy Ward in Cardigan, we have poverty rates approaching 40% child poverty rates. And those rates are equivalent to the child poverty rates in some wards in inner city Birmingham. And clearly there's work going on to address this issue. But for me, the issue is this: unless those efforts are actually aligned with a serious structural change and a real overhaul of the system that we're living under now, any of these efforts, no matter how well-meaning they are, and they are all very well-meaning, they are never actually going to be anything more than a sticking plaster on the kind of mortal wound that's been inflicted on the state by austerity. And I think it falls to the third sector and those voluntary organisations and charities to try to fill the gaps in those services. And also with food banks and the work that they're doing to try to fill the bellies of those hungry children, and to try and provide youth services that we've lost, so Thistle Youth in Llantysil and Ray Ceredigion, trying to plug the gap of mental health services, so we've got Campam in Lampeter, and of course our food banks in Aberystwyth, Lampeter, Carden, and now Llandyssil, and unfortunately it's a growing industry, isn't it, the rise of food banks. But there's certainly more people than ever before since the introduction of universal credit here, with its cruel 5-week wait, which is just extraordinary, and there is nowhere else in the US or in Europe that has that kind of length of a wait for benefit. The average wait for benefit payment is from 0 to 5 days, so we would be the only country to have that kind of a wait. So then what concerns me then is the strain that's actually placed on our third sector, particularly with the uncertainty of a no deal or a bad deal Brexit that's hanging over us. 60 pence in every pound has been taken away from local government budgets over the last 10 years, and that is the result, I have to be frank, of a politically motivated ideology, and that's the ideology of austerity. So those cuts have impacted Wales very profoundly, particularly hard, in fact, and that's despite a Welsh-led government and here applied-led local authorities' attempts to mitigate that damage. And all we need to do, in fact, is to look at 2 empty buildings that we have here in Aberystwyth. One is Aberystwyth Crown Post Office, which we fought so hard to save, and the other is the empty building of Borion Dead, which we fought equally hard to save. But the issue is no matter how hard we fought, we could not do anything about it, and the reason we couldn't do anything about it is because those cuts and those privatisations are being implemented from a Westminster government, and they are not happening here in Wales, and they are not happening here in Ceredigion. So, I've worked in the third sector and with vulnerable groups. During my adult life, I worked for Aberystwyth Women's Aid in the late 90s. I worked for a charity that actually I set up with some colleagues called Birdword between 2010 and 2012, which promoted emotional literacy in the women's prison estate. And I've come into politics on the basis of my lived experience, the experience of my own life, the experience of the work that I've done. And what's really interesting, I think, is the contrast that you would imagine might exist between the work that I've done in a prison and actually the work that I now do doing learning support in Lampeter University. Because what I would like to say is actually that the difference between being successful and being vulnerable is this thin, it's this fine, and the reason it's this thin and this fine is because it's based on luck. It's based on the luck of your birth. And I believe that it's absolutely wrong that a person's life chances should be determined by luck. I think it's absolutely wrong. That's why I'm standing for the Labour Party, because I believe that everybody should have equality of access to opportunity. The equality of access of opportunity to be fed, to be clothed, to be housed, to be educated, to love and to be loved, to be creative and to use our imaginations. And actually, that's why we need the radical change that we have to have in Ceredigion, in Wales, and in the UK under a Labour government. Thank you. Thank you very much. Chris, about yourself?
Noswaith da i gyd. Good evening, everybody. I came to Aberystwyth in 1982. I take up the post of consultant pathologist in Bromley Hospital, and I retired last year. I'm married. I have 3 daughters and 3 grandchildren. I served on Aberystwyth Town Council for 20 years, and in the latter part of that time, I was one of the Town Council representatives on Communities First. When I moved house, moved up to the Wine, so I decided I'd serve on Vinod Community Council, which I've been on for the last 8 years. And other things I do, I am very interested in the town twinning here between Aberystwyth and Cronbed. A lot of people from this area went over on school exchanges in the last 30 or 40 years. Unfortunately, that has now stopped because of child protection issues, or a problem, perceived problem with child protection issues. But we still have town twinning, and I've been secretary of the Town Twinning Association for the last 15 years. There's not much competition for that post. So, how did I get into politics? Well, when I was a trainee pathologist back in 1979 in Newcastle upon Tyne, there was an election, and I just didn't like any of the parties. And then I came across this very small, newly formed party called the Ecology Party. And that's the party that later changed its name and became the Green Party. And they were the only party that seemed to make sense to me. They were the only party that was thinking long term instead of the next 5 years. They were the only party that was looking at the real issues which affect people long term, like pollution build-up, resource depletion, population growth, global equity, things like this. We've had about 7 decades of more or less continuous economic growth since the Second World War. And, you know, we haven't really sat down and thought, well, at what point is enough? Enough. We are destroying the planet by this quest for continual economic growth. And the trouble is, with a conventional economy, if it's not growing, it doesn't work. So you have to change the economic system so that it'll work when it's not growing. And that's what green politics is all about. Lastly, of course, we've got the climate emergency. Well, I would say, well, okay, we've been working on policies to deal with this for several decades. But I'm glad to say a lot of other parties have jumped on the bandwagon and grabbed our policies, which is fine. I'm happy if all the parties do that, because that's the sort of policies we need to deal with the climate emergency. But the problem is they haven't grasped the link. I heard the Shadow Chancellor on the radio talking about all these great new green things in the Labour Party policy. And then 10 seconds later he's saying, so we want to grow the economy and have inward investment and all these things. He just hasn't made the link. So I hope people in this room will be making the link.
Thank you very much.
Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi, diolch i chi CAVO am trefnu noswaith mae heno. It's wonderful to be here in the park I have this evening for what I'm sure will be a lively discussion later on. A few words of introduction and about myself. My name's Ben Lake. I was born and raised in Lampeter. Although not many people actually know this, I did spend about 2 years in Penparcau as a babe in arms just in Southgate, where my father was a policeman in the town. Although we haven't actually put that on the leaf after we start doing that. But no, at Lampeter, I spent most of my time growing up. And my introduction to the work of the third sector was actually a familiar one. My grandmother, Fangi and Llandewi, yn parhau I weithio yn wirfoddol I country CAVO yn hwnna. My grandmother has for many decades now, along with my grandfather, volunteered for what we used to be called the country cars initiative. And as a young child growing up, I grew accustomed to having a telephone phone in Mangi's house, answering it and taking down bookings and orders for people who wanted to undertake a range of trips, usually from rural villages to different services, sometimes hospital appointments, other times perhaps do a little bit of shopping. But that, I suppose, pressed home the importance of what the third sector means. It's a collection often of individuals and groups and associations who work voluntarily, not for credit. Dyn nhw ddim yn gweithio am clod, dyn nhw ddim yn gweithio am y bri o gwneud y gwaith hanfodol bwysig yma yn y cymunedau ni. Ond nhw'n gwneud achos bod nhw'n gweld y gwerth o hyn I ni gweld yn y cymuned, y bywyd cymunedol. They do it not for the credit, but they do it quietly, persistently to help others in the community. And I suppose in my time as brief spell as a Member of Parliament, one of the nicest bits of the role was to go and visit organisations across the county who either arranged services or indeed delivered services for various aspects of the community. And what I think has changed, and something that I've been told time and time again, is the way in which funding and the resources available to too many of our organisations, volunteer organisations, are dwindling. But the demand, of course, is increasing. Hynny yn rhywbeth i gweld dim yn gyd rian. Mae'r nifer o galwadau ffôn mae'n cael yn cynyddu o hyd ac o hyd, ond mae'r nifer o gyrwyr ar y bnodau sydd ar gael i darparu'r gwasanaeth yn lleihau. I think this election, in many ways, it's dominated by one thing, as it's referred to, Brexit. And I have no doubt that, yes, it was a very important reason for its initiation. However, we do find ourselves at the crossroads, not just because of Brexit. Just mentioned the climate emergency, which will affect us all and certainly be so terrible for a future generation. But I think also, fundamentally, there is a question about the role, not just of the third sector and the expectations placed on third sector volunteer organisations, but also the role of the state. Big questions that are being lost in the debate about Brexit, and as we obsess about whether or not we should leave the European Union. And as I see it, and from the conversations that I've had with individuals from the sector, the uncertainty that our relationship with the European Union in status at the moment is causing, not just for the status, but also for funding streams, could not come at a worse time. And we have, again, this perfect storm of increased demand for services and reduced budgets. But that is partly, yes, the consequence of reduced budgets to public services, but it's also the fact that all this uncertainty of Brexit, a lot of the very important funding streams in West Wales and the valleys that have originated from EU structural funding are in doubt. Now, as we look forward, I hope, and I think some on the panel will agree, but others will disagree, I hope we can have some certainty and the continuance of some of these schemes. But even if not, there's a big challenge ahead of us in the formulation of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. And I, for one, am very glad to have worked along with colleagues from across the political spectrum of Westminster to try and formulate some sort of a plan that would give not just the third sector, but a whole array of organisations some certainty for multi-annual funding frameworks, and most importantly for us in West Wales and the valleys, not a penny less, because we are net beneficiaries of these structural funds, and along with that continue. As I said, there is that also a fundamental question of the role of the state and the expectations we place on third sector organisations, and I hope perhaps in the discussion this evening we'll go into it in greater detail. But it was touched upon by both Diana and I think Chris as well. Currently, the economic system that we have concentrates on ever greater growth. We know the underlying consequences it has for the environment and our natural resources. But also, I would like us to move as a country closer to what New Zealand are looking at the moment with a well-being budget. In my opinion, if we were to start prioritising well-being rather than just simple economic growth, we'd see a far rosier picture, not just for our communities, but for the third sector. And from that, we'll all benefit.
Sam, would you like to say a few words about that?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's an understatement, I think, for us all to say that this is going to be an interesting election. It's going to be a very, very interesting election. Not least in here in Ceredigion, because for the first time, I think, in living memory for us all, Amanda has not been piloted in from Conservative campaign headquarters. This is not just a first seat for her to cut her teeth in before she moves elsewhere. She is a candidate with local connections. She's a graduate of Aberystwyth University, where she met her husband David. She mainly grew up in Pembrokeshire. She's got family connections in Tregaron and regularly spends time in Bournemouth. After she graduated in 2005, she moved to Cardiff, where she became a solicitor for Eversheds, working with public and commercial organisations. In 2012, she moved back to Mid Wales, where she's retrained as a secondary school teacher. Now, what I've heard on the doorstep a lot is that people are frustrated by the Brexit process, and that's and I can totally agree with that. It's very, very frustrating that it's dragged on this long. Now, Amanda, like some in this room, I imagine, voted to remain, but she, like lots of other people who voted to remain around the country, recognised that there is a need to move on, to not block the process anymore, to move on so we can get other priorities done. Now, Amanda's priority for Ceredigion are to deliver Brexit, as I've said, to move on to bigger issues like climate change we've already touched upon, but also so we can champion local businesses, so we can champion Welsh farming, so we can fight for, we'll continue the improved fight for better infrastructure in Ceredigion, including mobile broadband coverage. We're also going to campaign for equal opportunities for young people like myself. Amanda is currently in the process of fighting for more support for care leavers, for example. Amanda's dipped her toe into politics more recently and is currently a county councillor in Powys, where she's chairing Children's Services Committee and sits on a foster panel. She also works for Russell George, who's a member of the Welsh Assembly, and she does comment, my varied roles to date have given me an understanding of the pressures and opportunities in both the public and the private sectors. He further adds, from speaking with people here, I can see there are fantastic opportunities in Ceredigion. If elected, I have the experience for working at various levels of government to be a strong voice for Ceredigion. I will fight to ensure that the Mid Wales Growth Deal stays on track and that we get the funding that we need to increase prosperity and to ensure this. On a personal note, I'm a 20-year-old student at Aberystwyth University. I study history and international politics. It's been lovely, actually, on a campaign trail to get out of the Aberystwyth bubble, lovely though it is, and to see more of this absolutely beautiful and fantastic county, which I hope one day to call home. I will try and represent Amanda as best as I can tonight. If you would like more information about her campaign, I have some leaflets here. She's also got a Facebook page where you can contact her directly. And with that, I shall take my seat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you all. So we can now move on to our questions. And as I mentioned earlier, we have two that have been submitted beforehand. So again, I'll keep an eye on time so we can get as many questions in as possible. So use it wisely. Focus on your own thoughts and your own party policies, and yeah, less possibly on others. So felly, os allwch chi ganolbwyntio ar eich hunan a'ch partïon eich hunan, bydden nhw'n gyrru. Os ydych chi'n cychwyn gyda Gethin, question cyntaf. Does your party have the ability to actually end this manufactured and completely unnecessary austerity for a better way? And is there a plan in place that would radically change the fortunes of Ceredigion?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
It is. Well,
obviously, we're a very new party. You know, where are we? Less than 8 months old. So when you say, have we got the ability? Well, first of all, we've got to try and get elected representatives in Westminster. We do have the largest group of representatives in the European Parliament, but we're all hoping that they'll be made redundant pretty soon. As far as policies to try and combat austerity, prevent Labour getting elected then, because when Labour were in power from 1997 through to 2010, they spent all the money. And the Tory austerity that everybody talks about is really just trying to rebalance the books. So the core thing, I think, is don't let public spending get out of hand. You know, as we've seen with the two main parties, actually, and many of the other parties here, some fantasy politics really going on. Nearly every day there's some new giveaway. You know, a couple of days ago it was reducing rail fares by a third. You know, and what do you call it? The Labour Party are going to spend £80-odd billion a year extra and they're going to tell us that we're not going to pay any more tax. Having realistic budgets is one thing, isn't it? And we haven't made any crazy sort of spending pledges. We've actually just tried to realign some of the existing spending that is in the UK budget. We don't believe we should be spending up to 100 billion possibly on HS2. I think that that money could be better redistributed and in providing better infrastructure across the country, especially in rural areas like here in Wales. Broadband services, our roads are falling apart, from underinvestment over the years, and they are the backbone in a rural community, I guess, where public transport is limited and difficult. We are reliant on being able to move around our county on decent roads. Broadband for business, it's been failed. There was an initiative to roll out broadband right across Wales, led by the Welsh Assembly government there, and it hasn't. I see in my own area, in Aberporth area, in Blaenporth, coils of cables hanging off poles that are not connected yet. So I think in terms of austerity, you do need to spend within your means, and a lot of people would say that we were a net beneficiary of European funding and Communities First projects and stuff like that. But let's not forget, as a UK, as a country as a whole, we were spending probably for every £10 we put in, we were lucky if we were getting £4 of that back. So if we're losing our money within our own country, right, we hopefully will be able to better provide for public services, supported by the third sector, but we shouldn't also see services diminishing within local authorities that the third sector has to be completely relied on. It should be a partnership and helping to work together. But in recent years, it's the local authority spending has been diminishing, and the third sector has had to step in even more.
I don't want to sort of be negative. I'm not going to talk about other parties. What I will say, though, about the comments that Gavin has made is that, in fact, the fantasy politics that he refers to are fully costed. There is a great book that's been published alongside the manifesto. If you want to look in there, you will see that the workings are extremely carefully calculated, and it's a very sound budget. But what I would say is that it requires a shift in people's thinking. What we need to do, bearing in mind where we are today, bearing in mind the urgency of climate change and the impact that that is having and is very visibly having on even our local immediate environment. If you look at the floods that happened with Storm Callum, if you look at what's happening to the coastline around Aberystwyth and in Gwynedd, you can see that climate change is a reality. My question would be, can we afford not to spend money? Can we afford not to rethink how we have been operating economically for the last 10 years? In terms of how a Labour government would benefit the residents of Ceredigion, the overhaul to the DWP, Department of Work and Pensions, in fact, will be scrapped and replaced. Universal credit will be scrapped and replaced. PIP assessments, the desperate cruelty of PIP assessments will be ended. These things will manifest in a hugely positive way upon many, many residents in Ceredigion. I've heard from so many people over the last 2 to 3 years of whose mother is a Lampeter resident, who was diagnosed with a very serious he had approximately between 6 months and 2 years to live. His PIP was eventually paid to him 4 days before he died. Him and his mother were living in absolute poverty during that time. There are many people like that in Ceredigion, people with dementia who are waiting for PIP payments, people with cancer waiting for PIP payments, people with long-term health conditions waiting for PIP payments here. And that system has to end because it's unutterably cruel. The £10 minimum wage will actually impact Ceredigion hugely. people in Ceredigion, there's a lower rate of pay here than there is in many, many other regions in Wales and across the UK. The National Investment Bank and regional development banks will be pouring money into Ceredigion and the rest of Wales. The wind farms that will be built as part of the Green New Deal, 20% of the public aspect of that funding, probably 20% of the profits from that will directly be returned to coastal communities. And we have several coastal communities here in Ceredigion that will benefit directly from that. Full fibre optic broadband being rolled out free to residents here, ensuring the quality of access to healthcare, to benefits, to also to business, in fact, that's desperately lacking because we cannot provide decent broadband access for those businesses. That will kickstart the economy here. But most of all, what we will be getting is an additional 3.4 billion in funding for Wales, which actually will only bring us back to the relative figure that we had in 2010. And we are desperately, desperately in need of that money, which is ours, and we should have had all this time to reflate the economy in Ceredigion and to bring back the real purpose of our public services, which is to hold us safe and hold us secure and give us a platform to be successful from. Thank you.
Right. Some of you will have heard of basic income, citizens' income. I look back, the Green Party introduced this in its 1983 manifesto, and we've been pushing it ever since. In 1983, everybody turned to us and said, "You're crazy." And now, mainstream economists are saying, this is the way to go. In a nutshell, a basic income is every adult in the UK is given a basic income from the state as a right. You don't have to claim it. It's given to you as a right. We've costed it in this manifesto £89 a week for every adult, not pensioners. Pensioners are higher. How is it funded? Well, if you're in paid employment, you will lose your tax allowances. So if you're in paid employment, you will pay more income tax, but you get your £89 a week. If your pay rate is fairly low, you'll be better off. If your pay rate is quite high, you'll be worse off. It actually squeezes the top down and the bottom up, so we have a much fairer society. But there are lots of other benefits. It benefits rural areas like Ceredigion, because the urban areas will tend to have more higher paying people, and the rural areas have more low paying people. So there'll be a net transfer of money from urban areas to rural areas like Ceredigion. It helps, if you're unemployed, by the way, you don't have to go and claim unemployment because you've got this basic income. You can decide yourself, do I want to go back to college? Do I want to work part-time or whatever? It's up to you. You don't have to claim it. You save so much money on administration. You don't have to have snoopers going around and photographing people at 6 a.m. to see if they have got a husband or somebody secretly with them. All that disappears. The other thing that's a big help in an area like this is if you want to become self-employed, it's very difficult at the moment. You know, what if you've got a family to support? Well, if you've got a basic income, it's a safety net. People can be so much more adventurous in the way they plan their lives. So if you want to put a big, really have a way of ending rural poverty, basic income is probably the best single policy you could have.
I think in terms of question about ending austerity, it's quite worth reflecting for a moment on why we need to end austerity. I mean, the UN rapporteur on extreme poverty visited the UK last year, and I think reported in November, and said that the poverty that he had witnessed in the UK, I believe actually did also visit Wales, part of his trip. He said that the extreme poverty that he witnessed in Wales was systematic, and part of a consequence, sorry, a direct consequence of the ideological cuts we've seen to the budgets of public services since 2010. And what does that mean on a human level? Well, on a human level, it means just in Wales, that nearly a third of children live in absolute poverty, according to the government's own definition of the word. And we just heard today that child homelessness in Wales is up 46%, and I have here 1,600 children this year alone, this Christmas, will not spend their festive season in a secure accommodation. Now, sometimes it's one thing to consider the balance in the books, but as somebody greater than I said, don't balance the books on the backs of the poor and the vulnerable. And when we're talking about austerity and ending austerity, it's very good to kind of remember why we need to do this, because of the human suffering that has come because of it. Now, some of the things that Plaid Cymru would like to pursue in terms of ending austerity, yes, there is need to bring public funding for public services back to 2010 levels. What does that mean? Well, it means for education, for example, in Wales, the Welsh Government would have nearly 300 million additional every year to spend on education if they so wished. It would also mean bringing the health budget back up if they so wish. The key importance here, of course, in the question of whether you have, the authority to enact some of these changes. Of course, we live in a quasi-federal system, so some of the actual decisions will be taken, quite rightly, on the Welsh Government level. But the job for MPs of Westminster is to lobby for that additional money. And I can't see any argument anymore when we've got record low interest rates for government bonds that we don't invest more in infrastructure, and we don't borrow to invest in capital infrastructure. We don't borrow to invest in productive output. It's almost as old as man that you do this because it makes economic sense, but it also has the benefit of being good for our communities. But some of the specific Westminster-centric, as it were, Westminster relevant policies that Plaid Cymru are pursuing, looking to change the benefit system. Universal credit has also already been mentioned this evening. And I think what we've seen just in the last 2 years, the way that it's been rolled out has been incompetent, to say the least, and cruel at the worst. We've seen the way that individual claimants need to wait for 5 weeks. 5 weeks before a payment. Often their landlords and wherever they're renting do not get the payments, and this causes them into debt. Then the government came out with a proposal to offer advance payments. But of course, the advance payments then need to be taken off subsequent payments at a rate of 40% to begin with. Now, this policy has been rolled out, trying to be accelerated. At the end of the day, it's not the budget of the government or the Department for Work and Pensions that's a real consideration here. What should be the consideration is the impact it's having on people and individuals. And just in my 2 years as MP, the level of suffering that I've seen because of the rollout of this policy, luckily in Ceredigion hasn't been fully rolled out, but even having said that, the level of suffering and concern that's been caused by the way that this new benefit system has been rolled out is quite extreme. Further to that, though, some of the policies as well that we're pursuing when it comes to the environment. Yes, Welsh Government has responsibility for energy projects up to 300 megawatts installed capacity, but above that, we have an opportunity at Westminster to unleash some of Wales' potential when it comes to green energy. We have incredible potential when it comes to wind, to hydro, particularly tidal lagoons, that we as a party would like to see fully capitalised upon. Because at the end of the day, not only will it help to ensure a new industry for Wales and new jobs for our people, but it also help to go a long way to address issues of fuel poverty. And on that topic in particular, when we're talking about poverty, fuel poverty itself is one of the big issues. And we can do a lot to mitigate the harmful consequences of that by looking to roll out a retrofitting scheme, such as the fantastic example of Energy Strong out in the Netherlands, deployed out in Nottinghamshire County Council, where they went about it to retrofit social housing to begin with, and halve energy bills, just by making them more efficient. So you've got the benefit of not only being good for the environment, but also for the well-being of people. And I suppose, to go back to my opening remarks, at this election, we're talking about rebalancing the role of the state almost. I think we should be pushing towards a new system of prioritising the well-being of people rather than a simple, old-fashioned obsession on just economics. Because at the end of the day, we've seen when we do that, we get agendas such as austerity. We get all the harmful consequences that follow on from it. And I think just to conclude, in terms of the authority, obviously some of these policies will be enacted by the Welsh Government, and the role of an MP is to lobby for the funding to enable them to do it. But also, I suppose, if the stories have to be believed, and there's a tightening in the opinion polls, and we find ourselves in Parliament, then 4 or 5 Cymru MPs can be incredibly influential in those circumstances, and I'm sure we leverage the best support for people in Wales at least, and hopefully for the rest of the UK.
So Amanda's view on this, and this is a view that I personally share as well, is that spending within our means to make our society economically sustainable is a good thing. But the way in which it has been implemented of late is not. As Ben was saying, that 5-week wait, that is totally unacceptable. I think we on the panel can all agree on that. Now, personally, as someone from Manchester, I have volunteered in food banks where I've seen the very people who are at the sharp end of these cuts. Now, that having said, we as a society, and this sort of strikes why I'm a conservative at the heart of it, is we must balance the needs of those who are dependent upon those who are working against the right of those who are working to hold on to the money that they work for. Now, we do get that wrong, and we appreciate when we do get that wrong, and we want our attention to be drawn to cases where we get that so very badly wrong. And it's an ongoing process to try and find that balance in the process. We, as a party, are spending £95 billion a year on working age benefits for people. Amanda and I do agree that it's much better for the economy if working people are better than if they're not working. And Welsh Labour, incidentally, have dropped their targets to eradicate child poverty by 2020. Basic universal income, we've also touched on that as well. This is my personal view, that universal basic income could, from I suppose a centre right perspective, could give people greater freedom in how they live their lives. Me as a student, if I had a universal basic income, instead of a student loan, I could have that opportunity to pay for my university tuition, or alternatively, I could go off and start a business with that money that the government gives me. So, in summary, the process of finding that balance is an ongoing process. I don't think we should abandon it. I think we should keep striving towards finding that balance, that fairity for taxpayers and for those who are dependent upon them. But clearly, we have not reached that balance just yet.
Thank you, Hazel. Well, I do reflect back sometimes to the early days, the very early days of the coalition government, and that infamous letter that was left by the former Chief Secretary of the Treasury, saying there's no money left. And there's no question in my mind that hard decisions were taken. So incredibly hard and difficult decisions for which some of us have been responsible. Maybe some of us paid some of the price actually for that. Not the severity of the price on some of those benefit cuts, but they were some very tough and difficult times indeed. And one of the things the Conservative Party, and I resist what Hazel asked us not to talk too much about other people's comments, but I just need to remind people that I think over the years before, the process of austerity was rammed through at such speed and alacrity that many people who were harmed were genuinely harmed by some of those decisions that some of us made. I was there, and I voted for some of those decisions, and some of those decisions I deeply regret. But time has now moved on. There are some of those reforms in the benefit system in particular that my party has learned the lessons of, quite frankly. But time has now moved on. There are some of those reforms in the benefit system in particular that my party has learned the lessons of, quite frankly. The sanction regime that many people have to face. The party is committed to abolish that sanction regime. So it's long overdue, so it should. The bedroom tax that I voted against, the party has sensibly reached a conclusion that that too should be scrapped. There are other examples as well. But you reach a point in time now when we need to look about advancing the economy forward. And just take some reflections. Reflect on is if you were in Bronglice Hospital, as I was today, if you never leave Bronglice Hospital without the opinion that the staff there are overworked, overrushed, and there are shortages there. And Ben will know as much as I did in my time, and whatever the difference between Assembly government and Westminster government, he will no doubt have been involved in many cases trying to speed up people's appointments and speak to consultants to get people edged up the waiting list. All those things, those problems are live, and those problems really affect people on the ground. I don't believe any of us would leave Bronglice Hospital with that image of people waiting unnecessarily for long periods of time. So if ever there was a case of massive investment in the National Health Service, it is now, and that's why my party's talked about a penny on income tax to raise 35 billion, huge figures, yes, but huge figures required over a 5-year period, of which a significant chunk of that money will come to the National Assembly government. We can't prescribe, because we're devolutionists, how the National Assembly will spend that money, but the hope and the aspiration would be that they would spend it, because there is a crisis of rural healthcare, and we need to be wise of that. I reflect on the lady I met in Bow Street today, who was a parent who desperately wanted to get to work, had an offer of a new job, but simply couldn't reconcile that job with the extortionate childcare costs. And that is why, again, I commend to you what my party is saying about free childcare for 2 to 4-year-olds, 35 hours a week. That parent would benefit those things as well. I reflect on education. I'm a primary school teacher now. I'm very lucky. I have a class of 15 eager year 60s, but some of my colleagues aren't so lucky with the class numbers and the lack of learning support assistance in those classes. That too requires additional resources. And the long-held issue of housing in this county. And we all know there's countless examples of young people that want their own home, want their foot on the property ladder, but are unable to do so. And we can walk around places not dissimilar to Pen Park High, which historically were council housing. Historically, that property then went on to housing associations. And now the legacy of Margaret Thatcher selling all that property off and not allowing local authorities to spend the receipts to build new local authority housing is there for all of us to see. Those are realities. And my goodness, those realities demand a new approach, which certainly my party, having learned some of the lessons of the past, has signed up to as well. I concur with what's been said about green policies too. That must underpin everything we do. I'm loath to condemn other parties that have seen the light on some of these policies, one party in particular, but I think it is pretty lamentable that for years of the coalition government, the Conservative Party seemed to be fully signed up to the Swansea Tidal Lagoon project, not just important for Swansea and Swansea Bay, but as a brilliant scheme, which would unleash so much potential in the whole of Wales, that then it reneged on its commitment, and that policy sits there collecting dust. So too, the promises that were made on the electrification of the rail line from Paddington through to Swansea, another important device for attracting people onto public transport. And I should place on my records, I know at least 3, probably 4, if not more, I hope on this panel are fully signed up to the reopening of the Aberystwyth to Carmarthen rail line. Important to regenerate our economy, but also to get people off roads and onto trains. And finally, the last point, we may touch on this later, I suspect we will, without responding directly to, can I just say that any plan for the future of Ceredigion, I'm sorry, you can't isolate yourself from Europe. I worry, as I think many people on this platform do, about people's jobs and livelihoods if we have a no deal or a bad deal Brexit. I was once told by somebody, one of my predecessors as MP, that you don't mess with people's jobs and livelihoods. And I'm sorry to say that if you speak to community projects, if you speak to those responsible for some of the capital projects, I come from Borth, coastal defences are important there. If you speak to farming families throughout this constituency, you will understand why this county voted Remain in 2016 and why, if we had the opportunity for another referendum, I suspect we'd vote Remain again.
So, reality, now another ail gwestiwn, now to our second question. Mater sydd wedi cael ei datganoli mater sydd yn unigryw I Geredigion, ond un sydd yn bwysig iawn I Geredigion. On to our second question, a matter that has been devolved, a matter that isn't unique to Ceredigion, but very, very important to the residents of Ceredigion. So we're going to focus a bit for our second question. The Healthier Wales policy and the transformation of health and social care are focusing on care nearer to home. With a crisis in social care in Ceredigion, do the candidates think that the shift in services from hospital to the community should continue to progress? We'll start with this.
Well, as you know, because I've mentioned it before, I was involved in the campaign to save Bodlonda residential home from closure, as were other people on the platform here as well. Unfortunately, the situation that we're now in with social care is that we have people in crisis at home who are being assessed by social services, and the checklist is ticked for them to receive, for them to be moved to residential care. And we have people in crisis stuck in hospital, equivalently ticked, so that they should be moved as well. But the issue is that there is nowhere for them to go. And we are absolutely in a state of utter crisis with social care. It seems to me that there just has to be some extremely radical adjustment to what we're doing. The closure of London, in my mind, is a tragedy. It's still there now. The bed spaces are empty. If we are in a situation as desperate as we are, it seems to me that there has to be some way that we adjust the legislation, we change things so that we have the equivalent of what might be a war act, so that we take those homes, we repopulate them, we put people in them, we give people the residential care that they need. At the moment, we're hung up on various aspects of red tape, the size of bedrooms, the fact, have you got a bathroom, this kind of thing. Actually, what really, really, really matters is that those people are getting the care that they need, delivered by people who are trained and qualified and look after them. And that's actually what's really, really, really important. I saw a film, the latest Ken Loach film the other day, and in it there is the sort of the primary female character in it is a carer, and she travels from workplace to workplace to workplace, looking after people in crisis in their own home. The work, the stress that she was under, that character, and it's a very accurate portrayal from people that I know who do that job as well. But the stress and the strain that she was under, and the desperate situation that people were in their homes, the fact that you go in, you have to text them to say, right, I've arrived, then 10 minutes later you get another text to say, right, now you've got to go. You have to leave people at these moments of absolute vulnerability in their homes. And there's something really, really, really inhumane about the way that we are looking after the vulnerable and elderly people who deserve so much better care, who've worked hard all their lives, who want to remain within their communities, but actually deserve to have somewhere like Bodlonda or the equivalent in whatever community they live in. Every single community should have a thriving Bodlonda. These assets for us should not be being diminished in the way that they are. I think it's absolutely imperative, it's absolutely vital, and all of us are going to be in that position ourselves. And we need to think about that when we're planning and designing the social care of the future. Thank you.
I think it's worth stressing that the whole ethos, the whole raison d'etre of this policy to move people out of hospital into the community is to save money and enable the hospitals to work more efficiently. So you have to ask, well, if the money's being saved on the one hand, why is it not being invested on the other? That it should be a no-brainer that the whole system works together and efficiently. And I don't know whether it's just accidental cock-up or deliberate, but Somehow central government has managed to put a spanner in the works at about 6 different stages along the way. And you feel like, I think it's partly because there are different ministries involved. And these ministries work in silos, you know, they never talk to the others. David Cameron said, oh, I'm going to get joined up government. He didn't manage it. That's the key. We've got to, if we can get all these people working together off the same song sheet, it should be a no-brainer. We should be able to set up a system. The money's there. A part of the problem is, I think, privatisation of a lot of the social care facilities, which meant that money got siphoned off for shareholders, etc., etc. That was a mistake. But there is a way we can get the system working, and we should do it.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. Wel, un o'r bethau fydden ni'n gweud wrth yw, eto I gwestiwn ni oedd Chris to echo what Chris mentioned there about questioning what is the purpose of some of these policy changes. Is it because we think we can do things better for the patient and the individual who goes through either the NHS or goes through social care, or is it because of extreme necessity because the resources are no longer there? And I suspect that in this particular instance it's a bit of a both, you know, that most of the drivers behind the policy changes is necessity because of reduced budgets, whilst we then put the veneer on it and hoping that we can make things more efficient and that the outcomes can improve. With respect to the particular policies, I would suspect that there needs to be a balance in that, yes, we need to bring hospitals to a certain point they can sustain expertise, because we know it's not easy to recruit and to retain experienced and specialised staff, and so there is a requirement to make sure that whatever level of hospital that it is able to cater, for want of a better word, for a sufficient number of patients to ensure that that expertise is held there. And so yes, perhaps there is a need to think again about how we can get more people into places like the structure of the health board, well, that I'm referring to, of course, it tends to be, I think it's fair to say, an emphasis to the south of the health board area, where there is a greater population within the health board. But if we look then to Mid Wales and to parts of North Wales, both of which are different health boards, Bronglais is ideally situated. Indeed, it's ideal for some of the population bases there, and the hospital there is so important to keep. So those sort of changes that have been raised in passing with some of these policy consultations, I think are fine to be welcomed. When it comes to social care, though, again, we have this disconnect all too often between health services, NHS, and social care. One of the things that my party is championing is bringing together of health and social care. Call it what you'd like, but to bring the two care services in our society under the same roof, under the same control, so that we can hope to get a bit more of a joined-up approach, I think somebody mentioned. But at the end of the day, if you're being transferred out of hospital, whether that is Aberystwyth or Glangwili down in Carmarthen, back to your home, the last thing you need is to wait for a care package and then you're stuck in hospital because you can't get the care package because whoever is responsible for the care package, usually the local authority, hasn't been able to get things in line because they weren't informed about it. These things happen. It's human error more often than not. But it is a consequence of the fact that you have two different limbs being operated by two different brains. Bring it under the same brain, and I'd imagine we'll see a lot better. Just to finish on this point about hospitals and some of the critical care locations, we need to decide as a society, particularly services for trauma, and still be safe. Because as far as I've been discussing things with a colleague of mine, Dr. Rhys Thomas, down in Glangwili, and he's, for example, proposing to increase the fleet. Now that will perhaps mitigate some of the issues that we have where you do have certain areas of Wales being miles and miles and miles away from the nearest centre, but yet in an emergency, that doesn't matter, you need to get there as soon as possible. But these are questions, ultimately, of delivery in the Welsh Government, but of funding still at Westminster. And if we are to address that, I'm afraid we're going to have joined up thinking on all levels.
And to an extent in Westminster. don't appreciate that in rural areas like this, it takes more money to deliver the same level of care as it does when compared to more urban areas. I think their formula sees our county, there's less people in it, therefore it leads to less money. It's exactly the opposite. You know, that's what I, for example. And I do agree with Ben. As a student, I see mental health issues on campus every single day. It's a massive issue for young people, and we're becoming increasingly more aware of it. And there's definitely more work to be done. But I think for too long, we as a country, not just in Wales, but in England and all parts of the Union, we are seeing physical care and mental health care and social care as three distinct things, linked to the same brain. It's all under one roof. Our NHS is very precious. It's precious to all of us on this panel, I think we can agree. Obviously, Conservatives do come under quite a lot of slack for it. To clarify, the party position and indeed my position is that we are not privatising the NHS. We do not want to privatise the NHS. It should be free at the point of use for every single individual. Yes, that's so. In short, we need to see more services coming under the same roof, seeing people holistically, not physical health, not mental health as two separate divisions. We need to bring that all under one roof, and we need to look at the funding formulas that we currently have in place that see places like Ceredigion receive less money. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Agree with what Sam said there about that artificial divide between physical and mental health. That has to be a bridge. In Bronghurst Hospital, where almost overnight we lost a residential mental health facility, and people turning up to go, other than potentially being locked up in a cell in Aberystwyth police station. And that was the reality of it, because police officers were telling me that as well. That issues and the geography, which we are constantly fighting for in this part of the county. I know if we were debating these things elsewhere in the county, the debate would be rather different. Services therein. Now, I want to talk about the non-deb a little bit, but not just specifically but non-deb. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but in nature, I'm an intention to deliver most care for the elderly in homes on the pretext that those elderly people, when instances where care packages have been put into place for elderly people that do not stand the test of any time whatsoever because they are inappropriate and unsuitable. The work has not been done, and the reality is that those elderly people need to have the opportunity to look at a range of different care. It might mean wards and facilities, sheltered accommodation, that kind of thing. It might be, yes, hopefully yes, independent living in someone's home. The reality is that we need to provide all of those options for people to run homes around this county. There was an important principle about it being a council-run home because it provided a safe gone. London provided a safety net for us, and that net has now gone. We don't know whether it's been sold. We are told repeatedly. I wish it would be reopened by the county council. That's wishful thinking. I wish and hope, second to that, that a decent. What cannot happen is that facility to remain as dire as set, empty of people and staff providing the service. Ceredigion County Council were always very elusive when we used to try and ask them how many families were living outside of county that would otherwise wish to be in county with their families, with their friends. That important component to living, having your friends and family around you. They were always very elusive. Somebody in this audience has been rather clever at freedom of information request and has got the figure. I can't remember exactly what it is. A friend of mine, a Wayne Bower, whose the only facility for her husband suffering from dementia was in Welshpool. Every single day for 3 years, from Wynevale to Welshpool and back again to see her husband. That is totally.
As a carer for my 98-year-old grandmother who's got increasing dementia, this is a subject very close to my heart. And I'll try not to get emotional talking about it. But I think all of the other panellists of our community hospitals. And the fact that we do not have that facility now, where people were in the critical care services of a main hospital, and then they were able to go to community hospitals much closer to home, where we were able to take care of their family. And that is a crucial thing that we have lost over the last 15 to 20 years. And you know, we've lost hospitals here in Ceredigion. A site inspection panel for this new hospital we're going to have in Cardigan, going to have 30 beds in it. And here we are, I think it's opened possibly in the last couple of days. I'm not sure exactly what's the situation there at the moment. And it's no more than a health centre. No beds, no provision, back into main services. Ben touched on something about bringing health and social care together. You know, as health services, some 10, 11 years ago now, where councillors that had input into health services, we have 3 counties that make up the whole of our health board. I think there's maybe 1 councillor that sits there now. That needs to change. I think we need to, health boards need to be re-looked at, and they need to have a healthy contingent of elected councillors from on the ground with the local councillors. And I think they were trying to professionalise the health boards, and we've got several of our health boards. I think care at home is the best thing that can be, and I do every day strive to keep my grandmother at home. But we have got diminishing services in old people's homes as well. But that is also this, you know, the product of trying to keep some people maybe that aren't able to live at home, to trying too hard maybe to keep them at home, if you know what I mean. But like I said, I think fundamentally we've got to go back to having more community beds in community hospitals, and having better care services and more transition through, in, you know, when people are ill, you know, and to get them home or under a care package, not sitting in hospital. He's on both sides having to be involved, if you're an occupational therapist on both sides having to be involved in trying to get somebody out of that hospital and back into either
Iawn. Kelly, os gyda ni unrhyw gwestiynau sydd wedi dod trwy'r cyfryngau cymdeithasol, any questions from social media? Any additional questions from the floor that tackles any issues that we haven't already covered? Unrhyw beth sydd yn delio gyda materion i ni ddim eisoes wedi delio gyda nhw? Question at the back there, Wendy.
I listened very carefully. I can't believe any of the readers of the words they've said. And I'm sorry. It's very sad.
Okay, Wendy, thank you very much. Can we start with Chris?
Right, we have a party leader. In fact, we have 2, because we, in the Green Party, we believe in job sharing and equal male-female representation. But we also have 1 MP. So I think you're well aware who Caroline Lucas is. I think a lot of you will have seen her on television recently and thought she's the only one on that panel who's speaking sense. And although she'd be a prime minister with a coalition of other parties, she could do it.
Thank you very much.
All right, pitch for the leader rather than ourselves, is it? Well, no, in terms of, similarly in a way, we've had our party leader, which is Adam Price, and a relatively new leader, elected last year, and has been making his first Westminster group of 4 Plaid Cymru MPs, and Liz there is our leader. And I think in the past 2 years, an unprecedented time in Westminster, where politics truly has have been, well, some would say a complete mess, others would say interesting. She's been able to keep her head and rise above some of the clamour in the House of Commons to be the voice of reason all too often in debates. And as part of a group of 4 at Westminster, we've been able to work cross-party on points where consensus can be found in order to leverage the most for our communities. Work cross-party on points where consensus can be found in order to leverage the most for our communities and respective communities in Ceredigion as well. So, perhaps one of the benefits of Plaid Cymru is, of course, not only that we are a compact, closely knit team, but we don't have to worry about any chain of command. You know, we are there with one mission and one mission only, that is to serve our communities, and whatever the issue of the day may be, make sure that our communities are marshal of the group of four, the other three of us, and she's been able to keep her head calm in what has been very testing time, and also been able to keep some order over a group of three men, which I think is an achievement.
Thank you. Sam, I'd like to remind you that this is being recorded.
Well, I dare say I have the hardest job for the panel. I can see some nods from the audience. Honestly, during the leadership election of the Conservative Party, I was out of the country, so I couldn't vote. It's very, very unfortunate. So obviously, I'm neutral in this entirely. Admittedly, when Boris was chosen, I confess myself a little bit disappointed. However, as time has gone on, and I've seen less what he's said and more what he actually has accomplished in his relatively short time as Prime Minister, I have to admit I'm impressed. I won't go as far as calling myself a convert, necessarily, to Boris, but you have to look at what he's achieved in his first 100 or so days as Prime Minister versus what Theresa May managed to achieve in 3 years, and judge him on that. If you judge Boris on what he says, I don't think you'll ever get past the front door. So my pitch to you would be judge Boris on what he does, as opposed to what he says necessarily. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, as you'd expect from a Liberal Party, which is rich in individualism, that we don't go in much for the cult of leader. I have two leaders. We have our leader, Jake Dodds, the Member of Parliament, until now, recently the Member of Parliament for Bradfordshire. Of course, Joe Swinson is the federal leader. And it would be dishonest to say that there have not been occasions in the past and in more recent years, months, weeks even, that I've had some disagreements with emphasis with them. You know, I have the Wendy question. Lots of people have asked that. I don't know with the experience of other candidates, but that has cropped up on the doorstep in recent weeks. And I just say to people, then, just remember who are the names on the ballot paper in Ceredigion. Here they all are, with the exception of Sam, and his colleague will be there. You know, you will be voting for a Member of Parliament for this constituency, which is where the next bit of your question, I think, is really more relevant, is the influence you have. I'm not a statistician, but Ben represented 25% of his group of 4. On one occasion, I was 12.5% of my group of 8, which might suggest something. But no, I think it is imperative of those leaders. Leadership surely is about listening. And whichever party we represent, the avenues that we have to our leaders are really, really important. They don't get things right all the time. They need to hear from the ground what's going on. I was once accused and criticised, actually, in the paper, I think it probably was in the Cabinet News, when I talked about the Westminster bubble. But the reality is that it is like that. Ben will relate to that. Others in our party hierarchies, I'm sure, will relate to that. And it's important to have people on the ground that tell our leaders as it is when things go awry or they become detached. Now, I'm not for one moment suggesting things are detached in Liberal Democrat circles at the moment, but I think I have the ear of my leaders, if necessary.
We'll often say that our leader is the most accomplished politician of his era. Unfortunately, for you lot, he's not standing in this election, so you're not going to have him as your Prime Minister. But for us, and you know, Nigel Farage, he's not standing, he's supporting us as candidates, and our main message is that we want to change politics for good. We don't think that the political system works as it is, the first past the post system. You know, when you see parties in 2015 getting 4 million votes and 1 elected representative, some elected representatives into Westminster and try to fight for changing the electoral system and restructuring. You know, we would abolish the House of Lords and the peerages. You know, that people just given jobs for life. So that's my only pitch.
Thank you, Hazel. So Jeremy Corbyn. So it's been quite interesting on the doorstep. It's very Marmite. What I would say is that what Jeremy Corbyn has done is something that is actually quite extraordinary. He's inspired and he's motivated a movement which is actually changing the face of politics in the UK and in Europe and in the United States. He's inspired a huge number of younger people here to become on the political landscape. Huge numbers of people, 600,000 people are now members of the Labour Party, and the vast majority of them have joined because of Jeremy Corbyn. And they've joined because of what he represents, rather than how he may appear personally to you. What I find very worrying on the doorstep is that the kind of criticisms that I hear of Jeremy Corbyn are not actually related to his politics. Some of them are, because obviously on the doorstep and you can discuss it with people. But the kind of criticisms that I hear of Corbyn are actually criticisms like he's anti-Semitic, which he clearly isn't, and actually the evidence that you see if you look at all of the early day motions that he's initiated in defence of the Jewish community, if you look at that he is not anti-Semitic. What I do get is I get a lot of personal comments from him. I get comments like, I don't know the way he speaks. I don't know the way he dresses. About personality. We are lost. Because what you end up with is a presidential election, where what you're talking about is large personalities that are combating with each other, and the policies that those people should be representing, policies that will change our lives, are irrelevant. And all you need to do is to look at what's happening in the United States with Donald Trump. And there is the evidence of the danger of that kind of attitude to politics. So I think it's really, really, really important that people judge Labour by its policies. What I would say, though, interesting about Corbyn politically, is that he isn't your usual kind of politician. So he's actually much more about discussion. Actually, the kind of policies that he's interested in, he wants to talk about, they're complex. Because politics is actually complex. It's not black and white. It's not simple. Where we are now, and how dangerous is that to be in a landscape where we have this and we have this, but we don't have the discussion and the consensus going on in between. And those are the kind of policies and politics that I believe that the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn actually represents. It's about a richness, it's about a discussion, it's about where we are, who can we be with, what kind of worlds and what kind of lives we want to lead, but it's not about these kinds of extremes of opinion. I would also say that the movement that he's inspired, actually, if you look at what's happening in the United States in terms of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, they are looking to what's happening here in terms of how they can then move forward internationally in the United States in terms of their politics. So his appeal goes beyond this kind of like, this caricature of personality or this caricature of policy. Actually, it has a kind of ramification that can be seen internationally, in Latin America, in the United States of America. And that's really, really important. And Corbyn is a conviction politician. He acts as he believes with his heart. And unfortunately, the political landscape that we now inhabit has politicians in it that don't actually tell us the truth. They don't actually really sort of translate their lives into the beliefs that they say that they hold. And in fact, just as an example, if we do look, I'm sorry, Sam, at Boris Johnson, if you look at the kind of comments that Boris Johnson has been making over the years in his Spectator columns, the racist comments, the sexist comments, now those are the kind of comments that we should be objecting to. That's the kind of politics that's actually really, really, really problematic for us here in Wales and here in the UK. I think in terms of, can I make a difference? Was that the question? I think I can make a difference. If what happens is I am elected, then what then happens is we have an additional MP who can form the mandate that we need in order to remove ourselves from the sort of the detritus of political life that we're in and actually radically transform the landscape back to something that's much more sort of natural and akin to where we came from in terms of the NHS and the welfare state, and that post-war consensus that actually brought a kind of real humanity and a real kind of fabric and texture of care to our lives.
I'm conscious of the time. Fi eisiau cymryd ar y cyfle I ddod â ni nôl I Ceredigion a ddod â ni nôl i'r prifysgol sector, cyn rhoi cyfle I chi wneud ychydig o sylwadau I gloi. Conscious of the time, so I want to bring us back to Ceredigion and back to the third sector before giving you a final opportunity after this one question to 60 seconds as a closing remark. Beth ydych chi'n hoffi gweld CAVO yn wneud gyda'r trydydd sector I wneud gwahaniaeth yn Ceredigion yn ystod eich term chi fel aelod seneddol? What would you like CAVO to be doing as part of our work programme with the third sector to make a difference in Ceredigion during your term as Member of Parliament? We start with Ben.
Wel, mae'n gwestiwn bach anodd oherwydd fi'n credu fel mudiad mae CAVO yn ei gymaint o bethau pwysig fel y mae. It's quite a difficult question insofar as CAVO actually does a lot of important things as it already for the third sector. You know, some of the big issues that I suppose are facing the third sector at the moment, I touched upon them in my opening remarks with regards to the uncertainty of funding streams in the future, the uncertainty of the policy environment that we might be operating in the new year, and also that challenge of, throughout all that uncertainty and the challenges of funding, able to recruit volunteers and retain volunteers and indeed staff. But I know for a fact that CAVO already does so much to help third sector organisations in Ceredigion in that regard. I suppose one thing that I should mention, the elected representatives on all levels, I think, would do well to work closely with CAVO in that you do represent the third sector in the county. You are, as it were, the perfect middlemen, I'm about to say, the middle people, and able to transfer directly some of the issues that third sector organisations are experiencing on the ground. I know from experience in the past 2 years, there was an issue, a particular issue that needed to be addressed in Westminster relating to community transport licences, and that was through a member of CAVO's board coming to me, raising it, that it would have affected and did indeed, in fact, impact upon several organisations in the county. And so I suppose one of the things that would be beneficial, not only to the quality of debate in Westminster, having that input from experts such as yourselves, but also representatives of this third sector in Ceredigion. At the end of the day, when whoever is elected and whoever represents us in Westminster, if they have CAVO and the third sector on their side, they could do a lot of legislation that will be inevitably discussed and formulated at Westminster. The MP for Ceredigion would be far better proponents and champions of the sector if they have that deadline to CAVO.
Sam.
I think it's, as a young person myself, I think it's really heartwarming to see young people of my sort of similar age taking part in third sector work, actually giving up their time on a voluntary basis to contribute more to their community, be getting more young people involved in their community through voluntary work. I think that would in turn benefit not just the community in which they're volunteering, not just coming together in the community cohesion, but I think that would also benefit them later in life. It's given them great experience on their CVs, and it's given me great experience on my CV. And of course, it's going to ensure that these sort of people who end up in Cardiff or in Westminster are going to have that real life experience that you can only really get through that sort of work. You know, paid work teaches you one thing, but I think giving your time freely to another cause that you're really passionate about, and your community teaches you an entirely different side of life. I know it certainly has for me. So yes, I think we should be getting more young people involved in this, more people from across different backgrounds to promote further community cohesion.
Well, I think the first thing that we must ensure is that CAVO itself as an organisation has the funding needs and requires to expand its work. And I know in the past there have been issues. You've faced staff and issues and people lost their jobs, good people that worked incredibly hard for the voluntary sector in this county. So, you know, whether that fight needs to be taken to Assembly government or UK government, Member of Parliament has a responsibility to do that. And I know from experience that, you know, for instance, if you're endeavouring to set up a community organisation and you are presented with that plethora of potential grant applications, CAVO has been a safe place to go to help those individuals and organisations navigate their way through a hugely complex system of grants. I don't possess that expertise. People used to ring me up and say, can you advise me, where can I apply? The instant reaction Ben alluded to was to forward them to you, because you know how to do it. You've got that body of expertise. I think also over the years there's been some experiences when you've had events, again related to what Sam said, to actually celebrate and praise volunteering as a principle. There's some amazing people out there across this county who, they're not just one-offs, they've spent whole lifetimes running lunch clubs, running those, again, Ben mentioned about the hospital car service, have done this for generations, and those people need celebrating, and CAVO does that. I'm a trustee of a couple of charities, the Hospice at Home Volunteers and the Cambrian Mountain Society, and you know, I think there's somewhere along the line there's a Celebrate Trustees Day. I'm not quite sure what that involves, but being a trustee of a charity is an important responsibility. And again, you've given people the opportunity to learn more about their responsibilities and their legal responsibilities in what potentially is a dry subject. But if you're going to be a charity and have charitable status, then you need to have trustees who know what to do as well. I think that the strongest thing, I think, though, is what you've done in terms of investment and encouraging in volunteers. And, you know, we talked earlier about why this is a special area and why, if I could give you the terms, the convergence funding, the West Wales and the Valleys objective funding area. We know there is a gap there in terms of funding. CAVO and the volunteering that goes on is one way of bridging some of that gap. So thank you for what you do. But you know, whoever's elected, I know, will be there to work alongside you.
I think most people these days got one of these in their pockets, and I think one of the things again, as somebody that's been trying to access services, you know, in my caring role and things like that, I think some user-friendly services and apps or something like that, the development I would help champion, I think, right? Something that gives easy access and simple signposting, right, to the services that are available to people, and the services, you know, and the things that people can volunteer to do. I think, you know, it's about making people aware, right? I think that's really what CAVO is doing, really, making people aware of the voluntary service sector in Ceredigion and across, you know, the whole of Britain, really. You know, we should be having this sort of system that helps people access services. People find it too complex often, or they don't understand how to access services. So anything we could champion to get people to have easy access and simple signposting to the services, and it works on both sides, for the service users and for the people that maybe are looking to volunteer but not sure how to do it.
Well, I've used CAVO services, and I have to say I hugely appreciate the times that I've been in, and I've sat down and I've discussed with some of the workers there funding applications, ideas for projects, how to develop or progress an idea for a project that me and other people may have had in the various sort of voluntary sort of work that I do in Lampeter. And I just want to say I do hugely value the service that CAVO. I have been and visited a few voluntary organisations. One of them, DDES, Dealt with Drugs and Alcohol Service, talked to me very specifically actually about the exclusion that they felt from involvement within a statutory service response to an incident that would involve a house where there was no drug use going on. And they said to me that how useful it would be if they could be brought in at the point of crisis to make the intervention that they needed to make. And it reminded me of when I worked for Aberystwyth Women's Aid. One of my roles in the job that I had was actually to develop the Ceredigion Domestic Abuse Forum. And that's exactly what we were doing there. And it reminded me of that. And I thought, actually, I was going to flag it up to you anyway and let you know, because I think that might be very useful. The other thing I was thinking about was actually volunteers. And my experience is that in a community, it's nearly always the same group of people that volunteer, the same issues always arise, and the same level of exhaustion arises within that group of people who all want to be doing everything they can do, but actually they are limited physically with no resources and actually emotionally as well. But I just wondered if it would be possible to develop some kind of peer support system for volunteers in different communities. And the last thing I was going to say actually is about a really good example of how CAVO has worked, and that's actually in place planning. The place planning scheme, which we've seen working very well in Lambton. CAVO, you've been extremely influential in kind of coordinating that, and it's really useful and good to see the coherent response between town council, voluntary organisations, members of the community and members of the business sector all working together, and you've been responsible for coordinating that. I think that's a really useful role as well.
Got their new deals, so and so. The fact is, decarbonising the economy, whichever party is in power, is going to create a whole new raft of problems and a whole new raft of solutions. It's going to be, people have likened it to the leading discussions, getting people aware of the issues, sorting out practical problems. I mean, if you've had an oil-fired boiler for the last 30 years, and suddenly they say, oh, you're going to have a ground source heat pump, then you're sort of 60 or something, and you think, what? There's an area that somebody from CAVO, they can have sorted out a plan, how volunteers can assist, etc. So there's at least 10 years' work for CAVO sorting out the new decarbonising the economy.
I'd like to finish our session and invite all candidates to take 60 seconds to share a few closing remarks to end our evening's session. And I'd like to start with Sam.
Are literally acting as the Ceredigion Conservative Association, so she was up against it. But I will say this: if you have never voted Conservative in your life, I ask you to give us your vote just this once. If you are the sort of person that is sick and tired of Brexit going round in circles and you want a clear way forward, I ask you to give us your vote just this once. Just this once, give us the chance, and you can never vote for us ever again. That's totally fine. I totally respect that. But just this once, give us that chance. Just this once, give us the chance to clear the way so that we can move on to pastures and you. So in short, vote for Amanda for a way forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. Mark, your 60 seconds.
I'll be jotting it down very quick. Well, firstly, I hope my opening remarks, when I talked about the community organisations, illustrate the fact that I very much believe in this community. I believe in its vibrancy and its diversity and its strengths, and we should promote those and celebrate those. And I want to work again for this community, and I don't profess to always get everything right. We're all human, we have human frailties and make mistakes. But I listen, and I did before, and I'd be honoured to do it again, to listen to what my constituents are telling me for the betterment of this community. And I go back to that quote I said at the start about you don't mess with people's jobs and livelihoods. That has been the core of everything that I've tried to do in this constituency in the past. I've done the job before. I'd be very honoured to do it again in the years ahead. But I just say this as well. However, whichever candidate you're disposed, highest turnout anywhere in the United Kingdom. It's waned for all sorts of reasons in recent years. whatever the individual outcome of the election, let's send a really confident message that this constituency believes in democracy and wants to participate in our democracy. Because if we ignore that, my goodness, we do such uphill.
Thank you. I do believe I have the qualities to represent you in Parliament. I've operated at a high level in public service as a cabinet member here for 5 years as a cabinet member here in Ceredigion. And I remember Mark telling me once how I had more power as a cabinet member than he did as being enacted. And we've heard from the candidates here, I'm the only person that is standing for election in Ceredigion that voted to leave. I wanted to truly take through that democratic vote of the people of Ceredigion and the people of the country to leave. So there's 18,031 people voted to leave in Ceredigion. I don't think that's probably represented here in 45% of the audience, but I'm standing up for those people that voted to leave. I'm the only candidate that can do that.
I think, well, look, okay, so the woman that actually I most admire in Parliament at the moment is Mari Black. I think I'm committed to changing the world as she sees it. And I think that that is the kind of, she really appeals to me because I think that actually probably we share some qualities. I think that you need to be voting for a party that actually has the capacity to change. And I hear what Sam says about how the Tories have the capacity. But I would say that judging on their record, they don't have the capacity to change. And that's actually what we have to see happening now. We are in a desperate place for many reasons: austerity, climate change, everything that's been talked about tonight. But we have to realise the change. And I think that it has to be Labour, because we're the only party that are actually able to move us beyond the day-to-day struggle, which is exhausting us individually and exhausting our communities, and move us to a better place where we can actually reach backwards and forwards to how we used to be and how we really want to be. So I would ask you to vote Labour. Thank you.
Okay, I won't even take 60 seconds. If you think climate emergency is the #1 issue, then vote Green Party.
It has been the biggest honour of my life to represent Ceredigion for the past 2 years. As a Cardi born and bred, I can't think of a greater honour of serving you, home communities, any big issues to be dealt with. Climate emergency, Brexit, and the relationship between, indeed, the role of the state in our society. Given that honour once again, that Ceredigon's voice will be heard at Westminster. A maen nhw'n dweud mae'r gymuned yma, mae'r sir yma, neu'r ddesgyn ni a'n cnawd. Fe os bydden ni yn cael yn ail ethol, byddwn ni'n popeth i'n eithafu i wneud yn siŵr bod buddiannau yn cymunedau ni yn Cefn Gwlad yn cael ei diogelu.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, thank you very much. A diolch i chi am fod mor barchus fel ymgeiswyr at eich gilydd. Thank you very much for being so respectful to each other as candidates. Journey home.